73 sheep came back on their own. The dogs came back on their own. Rufino Cardenas did not. His footprints went up the slope and then stopped. They didn't veer off. They didn't vanish into a fall. They didn't scatter in any direction. They ended, as if the ground had simply refused to record the next step, and every step after that. 40 years living in those mountains of Argentine Patagonia, 40 years knowing every rock, every shift in the wind, every yard of terrain on that hillside. A man who did not get lost. A man shaped by the land itself. He disappeared on a July morning in 1987 as if he had never existed. There was no body, no blood, no sign of struggle on the ground. His staff was resting on the earth carefully, not thrown, not dropped, placed, as if he had stopped, calmly set it down, and then ceased to exist. 18 days of searching. 18 square miles combed. 0 answers. What investigators found on that slope, and buried in the back of a file no one was meant to open, turns this disappearance into something the word mystery can no longer contain. You're about to step onto that ground, and it hasn't given anyone back. Go ahead and hit like now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because what you're about to watch isn't a reenactment. It's not a dramatization. It's the raw record of something that happened, was investigated, and never solved. Drop a comment below telling me which city you're watching from. I want to know where the people who make it to the end are coming from. Paso Gregory sits in southern Argentina, a place where winter doesn't ask permission, where the wind cuts through you before you realize you're bleeding, where fog rolls down from the mountains with the weight and texture of something alive, where the horizon disappears without warning and reappears in the wrong place. The cold there isn't just temperature, it's pressure. It's the constant sensation that the land around you is evaluating you, measuring you, deciding something about you that you won't understand until it's too late. The people who live there learned long ago not to question what the mountain does, because the mountain doesn't answer. It simply continues to exist, with the absolute indifference of something that was there before any human name, and will remain after all of them are gone. Rufino Cardenas understood that better than anyone. 52 years of life, 40 of them on those slopes, had turned that terrain into an extension of his own body. He didn't check the weather, he felt it. He didn't follow trails, he made them with the repeated weight of his own steps over decades. He was the kind of man the land produces once in a generation, the kind who doesn't disappear. And on an ordinary morning in July 1987, that is exactly what happened. What investigators found on that slope, and what they chose not to include in the official report, is what will make you question everything you think you know about what can happen to a human being in an isolated corner of Patagonia. You're about to step into this story, and it still isn't over. Rufino Cardenas woke up at 4:40 a.m. on July 14, 1987, the way he had every morning since he was 12 years old. There was no alarm clock. There was no need. His body had been calibrated by decades of routine in those mountains, and his instincts worked with a precision no clock could replicate. He got up, lit the wood stove, heated water for mate, and stepped outside to check the sky before even pulling on his boots. The air outside carried the kind of cold that splits bone. Not the damp coastal chill that seeps in slowly and settles with patience, but the dry Patagonian winter cold at its peak, the kind that hits all at once, tightens your throat, makes your face burn as if the wind is stripping away your skin layer by layer. Rufino stood in the doorway for a few seconds, breathing it in with the familiarity of someone shaped by it for 40 years, and looked up at the sky. The zenith was clear, but down in the valley, about 50 feet below his line of sight, fog was already gathering in dense, compact layers, a color that was neither white nor gray but something in between, the specific shade of Patagonian cold when it decides to settle in. The fog crept between the rocks slowly, heavily, as if it had intention. Rufino watched it for a few seconds, turned, and went back inside to get ready. To someone unfamiliar with that environment, low valley fog before sunrise might seem like a warning sign. To Rufino, it was just winter being winter. He had gone out in those conditions hundreds of times. He knew exactly where the fog thickened, where it burned off with the morning sun, where it lingered until noon regardless of the forecast. He knew the fog on those mountains with the intimacy of someone who has lived alongside something for decades without ever needing to name it. His wife, Dolores Quispe, later told investigators he left like he always did. No hurry, no change in behavior. He drank his mate in silence, grabbed the staff that leaned against the wall by the door, called the dogs with 2 short whistles. The sound echoed across the slope and dissolved into the wind, and walked out. Dolores had her back turned, tending the coals in the stove. She didn't see him leave. She only heard the door creak shut, and then the silence outside. The kind of silence a closed door makes when the person who just walked out isn't coming back. She didn't know that yet. The herd Rufino led that day consisted of 73 sheep and 2 rams, a number he knew by memory, counted every morning before leaving and every afternoon upon return. The route for that time of year was always the same, up the eastern slope where the sun hit first and melted the frost before 9, grazing at mid-elevations where the grass endured through winter, descent before nightfall. A path he had walked hundreds of times. A route that normally took 6 to 8 hours. A route he knew with the precision of someone who could name every rock along the way. The dogs came back at 2 p.m. That was the first sign. Rufino's border collies, Tinto and Brasa, trained by him since they were pups with an obedience neighbors described as almost unsettling, never returned without him. Never. In years of herding, through storms, in conditions that forced other shepherds to abandon flocks and seek shelter, Tinto and Brasa stayed with Rufino until the final step home. It was loyalty built not on affection but on repetition, on routine, on the kind of bond that forms between a man and an animal when both spend years doing the same work in the same place. When Dolores saw them come through the gate alone, she stopped in the middle of the yard. The wind moved through the dry winter vegetation with the constant brittle sound that landscape produced, a low, steady rustling without variation. Tinto and Brasa weren't agitated. They weren't injured. They sat side by side at the entrance, looking at her without barking, without moving, with a stillness that wasn't the stillness of rest. It was something else. A stillness Dolores couldn't name in that moment, but never forgot for the rest of her life. The herd arrived 40 minutes later, 73 sheep and 2 rams, the exact count, all intact, all calm. They came through the gate in a line, evenly spaced, the way animals do when they're being guided. But there was no one behind them. No shepherd, no Rufino. Dolores grabbed her oldest son, Marcos, 17, and the 2 of them headed toward the main road. The first neighbor they reached was Higinio Salcedo, about 1.25 miles away. After hearing what had happened, he saddled his horse in less than 5 minutes and rode toward the slope with Marcos without asking questions. Marcos later said the silence during that ride was more disturbing than anything Higinio could have said. As if he already knew before they reached the hillside that nothing good was waiting there. They found the staff at 4:30 p.m., about 300 yards above Rufino's usual rest point, resting on the ground horizontally with the precision of something placed deliberately. Beside it, in mud partially hardened by frost, Rufino's footprints climbing the slope at the regular spacing of someone moving at a steady pace. Ending at a specific point, no continuation, no deviation, no sign that his body had shifted direction or posture before stopping. Higinio stood in front of the last footprint for a stretch of time he couldn't later measure. He looked at the ground, at the rocks, at the sky darkening with the brutal speed of Patagonian winter. And he told Marcos, in the voice of someone forming a thought he didn't want to form, that there was no explanation for that. Marcos Cardenas, 17 years old, stared at the spot where the prints ended and said nothing. When they returned home and Dolores asked what they had found, he looked at her for a few seconds and said only, "His staff is there. He isn't." The police were called that night, and what began as a search for a missing man on a familiar hillside quickly became something the investigators themselves didn't know how to classify, because the terrain had recorded no accident, no escape, no cause. It had recorded only absence, clean, abrupt, and absolute. When investigators arrived the next day with equipment and tracking dogs, they found something beyond the footprints, something that never made it into the official report, but that one of the officers described in a private letter 7 years later. Something in the soil that had no name in any investigative manual any of them had ever read. The provincial police team arrived in Paso Gregores on the morning of July 15, roughly 18 hours after Rufino Cardenas disappeared. There were 4 men, Chief Inspector Osvaldo Pereira, 2 field officers, and a technician responsible for photographic documentation. They brought basic search equipment, topographic maps of the region, and 2 tracking dogs from a neighboring precinct. The sky was overcast. The wind came out of the southwest with the metallic steadiness of deep winter, carrying particles of dry snow that didn't accumulate but cut, at faces, at hands, at any inch of exposed skin their gear failed to cover. The temperature on the eastern slope had been below freezing since before dawn and showed no sign of rising. Pereira had worked 21 years in the Patagonian region. He had investigated deaths by exposure, falls in rough terrain, drownings in snowmelt rivers, disappearances the land resolved within days, because Patagonia was brutal, but it was legible. Every type of accident left a signature in the terrain. Bodies that fell left impact marks, scrapes on rock, displaced soil. People who became lost left fragmented tracks, direction changes, signs of progressive disorientation. Cold that killed left the body where heat had run out. Everything had a language. Everything could be read by someone who knew where to look. Pereira knew where to look. That was what made him efficient, and what made what he found on that slope impossible to process within the framework 21 years of experience had built inside him. He reached the footprints at 9:40 a.m. Higinio Salcedo and Marcos Cardenas guided the team there, keeping their distance to avoid contaminating the ground. The chief inspector crouched in front of the last prints without speaking. He studied the pattern for several minutes with the closed focus of someone searching for something specific and not finding it. Then he stood and walked slow circles around the area, scanning the ground with a concentration his officers rarely saw from him. The footprints were exactly as described. Regular, firm, spaced with the precision of a man walking uphill at a steady rhythm. And they ended. No transition, no change in pattern, no sign the body had shifted posture or direction before stopping. The final print had the same depth and angle as the ones before it. No deeper impression to suggest a sudden halt, no drag mark to indicate a fall, no lateral scuff to imply imbalance. It was the footprint of a man in normal motion. And then clean, untouched ground hardened by frost, as if no human weight had ever pressed there. The tracking dogs were brought to Rufino's staff to pick up his scent. They followed the prints normally, climbing the slope with the focused determination of animals actively tracking, noses low, bodies tense with work. They stopped exactly where the prints stopped, and stayed there. They did not move forward. They did not veer off in widening arcs trying to recover the trail. They showed none of the agitation typical of dogs that lose a scent. No frantic circling, no visible frustration, no attempt to return to the last strong point and restart. They stood still at the edge of the final print in complete silence. When their handler urged them on, both animals stepped back, not in visible fear, not in agitation, in deliberate refusal, as if the ground ahead had ceased to be ground. Aurelio Montoya, the handler, with 15 years of search experience in the region, told Pereira he had never seen that behavior. When a dog loses a trail, it shows active confusion. What these animals displayed was not confusion. It was something else. Something Montoya never found a word for, and according to testimony he gave years later, never did for the rest of his career. That day the search expanded to a radius of roughly 1¼ miles from the final footprint. They covered ravines deep enough to swallow a man, rocky outcrops where a body could be lodged out of sight, patches of dense vegetation where the soil turned soft and unstable, and the banks of 2 narrow streams cutting down the slope with the force of meltwater. The wind made communication difficult. Every order had to be repeated. Every confirmation arrived delayed. The dry snow kept slicing. The temperature kept falling. They did not find Rufino. They did not find blood. They did not find a scrap of clothing. No personal item beyond the staff already recovered. No sign that a human being had been present on that hillside beyond the footprints everyone had already seen. The land was empty in the most absolute way land can be empty, without even the residue absence usually leaves behind. It was late on the second day that Officer Seferino Lamas found the anomaly. Lamas was working alone in a rocky section about 80 yards northeast of the footprints, sweeping the ground in a grid pattern Pereira had assigned to avoid overlap. The cold at that particular stretch of slope felt different, denser, more static, lacking the variation the Patagonian wind normally imposed on open ground. Lamas noticed that before he saw anything. He realized the wind had stopped reaching that area, though there were no rock formations around it to justify shelter. As if the air there carried a different density, a different resistance, a quality that did not match the environment surrounding it. Then he looked down and saw it. A strip of ground roughly 13 feet long and 5 feet wide where the low vegetation was dead. Not winter dormant, high-altitude Patagonian grass does not die in winter. It sleeps, and the difference is obvious to a trained eye. Not trampled, not uprooted, dead in a specific, unsettling way. Blackened at the base, stems collapsed inward, as if something had extracted all moisture from every plant in that precise rectangle of soil simultaneously, while the vegetation immediately beyond its perimeter remained intact, dark green, entirely normal. The outline of the strip was almost regular, not perfectly geometric, but regular enough that the regularity was the first thing anyone would see. Regular enough to make it impossible as the product of any natural process Lamas could identify. He called Pereira. The two men stood in front of the strip for a long time without speaking. The wind that had vanished in that section remained absent. The silence there was not the kind Patagonia produces, because Patagonia almost never falls silent. Pereira ordered the technician to photograph everything in detail. He instructed Lamas not to discuss the find with anyone outside the team. The record was made. The photographs entered the internal file, and then they vanished from the official case documentation, not misplaced, not accidentally omitted, removed. That is what Seferino Lamas described in a letter to his younger brother in 1994. 7 years later, a letter discovered among his brother's belongings after his death in 2011, and partially transcribed by an Argentine researcher who published excerpts in a regional bulletin on unsolved cases in 2013. In that letter, Lamas described the strip with precision that made it clear the image had never left his mind. He described the geometry of its perimeter. He described the texture of the soil within, denser, colder, slightly darker than the rest of the hillside, as if that rectangle of earth had a completely different formation history from the surrounding ground, as if it did not belong to that slope. And he described what it felt like to stand there. He wrote, "The place had no smell, not the scent of dead earth, not frost, not the wind that moved everywhere else on the hillside. It was like standing inside a silence that wasn't auditory. It was spatial, as if that rectangle of ground existed outside the rest of the terrain, as if you could step out of it and re-enter a world where physical laws functioned normally, which meant that inside it, at that moment, they were not." Pereira never commented publicly on the strip. The official report recorded only the footprints, the staff, and the negative search results. 18 days of operation, 18 square miles combed, 0 conclusive evidence, case archived as disappearance, cause undetermined. But the strip was there, and it had not been made by any hand, any process, any force that anyone present could name. The silence around that question did not fade with time. It deepened, and it continued deepening, until 3 weeks later, when a woman knocked on Dolores Quispy's door with information she had kept out of fear, not fear of being dismissed. A different kind of fear. The fear of someone who understands immediately and viscerally that naming what she saw is a way of drawing the attention of something she does not want knowing she saw it. Celestina Huanca was 63 and lived less than a mile from the slope. On the morning Rufino disappeared, she had been outside before dawn, and she saw something on the mountain she never told the police about. Celestina Huanca was 63 years old in July 1987 and lived in an adobe house roughly 3/4 of a mile from the eastern slope, the same slope where Rufino Cardenas had vanished. She had been a widow for 11 years, lived alone, and had the habit of waking before dawn to fetch water from the stream that ran behind her property. It was something she did every day regardless of season, weather, or the kind of cold that particular July dropped to 10 below 0 Fahrenheit before 5 in the morning and turned the walk to the stream into a test of physical endurance most people would not have tolerated. Celestina tolerated it. She had spent 63 years tolerating that environment. She had built the body and habits of someone no longer surprised by Patagonian winter, someone who knew exactly how to dress, how to breathe, how to move through dry cold without wasting heat. She knew every yard of the path to the stream by heart. knew where frost made the ground slick, knew where the wind shifted direction behind the quarry and cut at a different angle. On the morning of July 14, she was outside at 5:20 a.m., a bucket in each hand, when she stopped. She stopped because she saw light. Not the light of dawn, that time of year and at that hour. The sun was still more than an hour below the horizon. Not the beam of a flashlight or torch. A handheld light flickers, projects outward, throws shadows. This did neither. It was a patch of white, static brightness in the middle of the slope. No flicker, no visible source, no cast shadows around it. A light that illuminated nothing but itself, existing in the darkness of the hillside like a solid object inserted into the fabric of night, with defined edges, physical presence, the unsettling quality of something that should not have dimension, and yet did. Celestina estimated its position between the first and second bend of the path Rufino usually took uphill, the same elevation where, hours later, Higinio Salcedo and Marcos Cardenas would find the staff resting on the ground and the footprints that ended in open air. She stood there for a span of time she could never measure afterward. It might have been a minute. It might have been 10. The cold continued. The wind continued. The dry winter rustle of Patagonian brush continued. Everything around it behaved normally, with the usual texture of that place at that hour. Only the light was wrong. Only the light existed outside what that landscape should contain. And then it wasn't there anymore. It did not fade like an ember burning out. It did not move in any direction like a lantern being carried away. It vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, present one instant, absent the next, with no transition, no residual glow, no visual afterimage to suggest it had ever existed. Darkness reclaimed the slope. The wind continued. The cold continued. Then Celestina heard the sound. It was not a scream, not mechanical, not animal. It was the sound air makes when something of considerable dimension passes through it fast enough to create a pressure disturbance. Not a noise of volume, but of displacement. She felt it more in her chest than in her ears. A wave that moved down the slope from high to low in an interval too brief for the human ear to register as duration. As if a vast amount of space had been occupied and released simultaneously in a single pulse, without repetition. And then silence. Not the ordinary pre-dawn quiet of Patagonia, which carries its own texture. Low wind that never fully stops, the occasional late call of a nocturnal bird, the distant stream sliding over rock. A different silence. The silence of a place emptied in a way that was not natural. As if something that should have been present on that stretch of slope had been removed, and the absence left behind a vacuum the surrounding air had not yet filled. She went back inside, set the buckets down, did not go out again that morning. She did not go to the police. She did not tell her neighbors when the entire village began moving after Dolores asked for help. She stayed inside while the men saddled horses and rode toward the slope, while women gathered along the road exchanging quiet information, while dogs barked at the unusual movement that afternoon. She remained inside, and she remained silent. It was not fear of being dismissed. Celestina Huanca was not a woman concerned with what others thought of her words. 63 years in that environment had stripped that kind of vanity away. The fear was different. It was the specific fear of someone who has witnessed something that should not be happening and understands, instantly and instinctively, that speaking it aloud is a mistake, that describing it is a way of drawing the attention of something she does not want knowing she saw it. She used that exact formulation when she finally spoke. Something she did not want to know she had seen it. 3 weeks after the disappearance, when the search had ended and the case was officially archived, Celestina knocked on Dolores Quispe's door on a Wednesday afternoon. Dolores received her in the kitchen. Marcos was outside in the yard. The two women sat at the table for nearly 2 hours, long enough for the winter sun to complete its short arc and begin slipping behind the mountains. Leaving the kitchen in a dimness neither of them rose to interrupt by turning on a light. When Celestina left, Dolores stood in the doorway watching the dirt road until her neighbor disappeared around the bend. Marcos came inside and asked what she had said. Dolores replied only that Celestina had seen a light on the slope the morning his father disappeared. Marcos asked what kind of light. Dolores did not answer. She stared at a blank stretch of wall for a long moment, and then said she was going to start dinner. Marcos did not ask again. Celestina's account entered public awareness indirectly. The researcher who had transcribed Ceferino Lamas's letter interviewed Marcos Cardenas in 2012 when he was 42 and still living in the region. It was Marcos who described Celestina's visit and what his mother had told him that night. Celestina had died in 2003, Dolores in 2008. Neither had given a formal statement about the incident during their lifetimes. But there was one detail Marcos added, something Dolores had mentioned that night in 1987 almost as an afterthought, almost as a secondary detail, yet one he had stored with absolute clarity, as if recognizing some information does not repeat itself. Celestina had said that at the moment the pressure pulse moved through the air on the slope, she looked at her own dogs, two animals sleeping outside against the wall of the house, silent all night. When the pulse hit, both woke at the exact same time, stood, and stared toward the slope for roughly 30 seconds. They did not bark. They did not move. They simply stared, rigid in the specific posture animals assume when they have identified something and are deciding whether to react. Then both lay back down, turned their backs to the slope, and did not look that way again for the rest of the night. Marcos Cardenas told the researcher he believed every word of Celestina's account, not because he needed an explanation for his father's disappearance. By 42 he had learned to carry that absence as permanent structure, but because there was something in her description consistent with something he himself had felt that afternoon on the slope with Higinio, something he had tried for 25 years to articulate precisely and never could. The silence at the end of the footprints was different. Not different as absence of sound. The wind was there. The hillside made its usual noises. Different in the quality of space. When he stood on the square yard where the prints ended, the environment seemed to absorb sound rather than let it move, as if there were an invisible boundary between that patch of ground and the rest of the slope, a membrane not physical but real, one he crossed each time he stepped in or out of it. Step out. The sensation vanished. Step in, it returned. He did it 3 times before Higinio called him down. He had never told anyone until 2012. When the researcher asked why he had kept it for 25 years, Marcos gave the same answer Celestina had given Dolores. Different words, different structure, same core. There was something at that point on the slope that did not want to be examined. And he had learned, instantly and without conscious decision, that it was safer not to examine it. The researcher published the full account in a regional unsolved cases bulletin in 2013. That bulletin reached a geologist at the National University of Patagonia, a man who had spent his life translating the inexplicable into measurable data, a man who, upon reading the description of the dead vegetation strip and the spatial silence on the ground, recognized something he had documented alone 10 years earlier on an uninhabited slope 150 miles to the north, and had deliberately chosen not to publish. Victorino Salinas was 47 years old when he read Marcos Cardenas's account in the researcher's bulletin in 2013. He had been a tenured professor in the geology department at the National University of Patagonia for 18 years, specializing in soil dynamics in extreme high-altitude environments. He had spent 3 decades walking the slopes of the Patagonian Andes with measuring equipment, field notebooks, and the methodical patience of someone who understood that the Earth stores information in layers, and that each layer has its own language, readable if you know where to place your hands. He was not a man who used the word inexplicable lightly. He had devoted his life to translating what appeared inexplicable into measurable processes, into data, into sequences of cause and effect the terrain always provided if questioned precisely enough. To Victorino Salinas, geology was a discipline of patience and accuracy, not mystery. Mystery was simply the stage before understanding. It was what existed before you asked the right questions. What he had found in March of 1983 had fractured that framework in a way 10 years of distance had not repaired. That month, Salinas was conducting a topographic survey in an uninhabited stretch of the range approximately 150 miles north of Paso Gregores, at an elevation of about 4,300 feet. It was an area without marked trails, without regular grazing activity, without any documented human presence in the previous decades. The terrain there was narrow and technically demanding, basalt outcrops alternating with clay depressions that overnight frost turned into treacherous surfaces. breaking unpredictably and without sound beneath weight. Salinas worked alone in that section, with an assistant stationed at a base camp nearly 2 miles away, because 2 operators moving simultaneously across that type of ground contaminated soil samples through cumulative vibration. The cold at that elevation in March carried the edge of early Patagonian fall, not yet the severity of deep winter, but enough that each exhale formed vapor and bare hands lost sensation in under 10 minutes. The wind came steadily from the southwest, rendering fieldwork persistently uncomfortable, not dangerous, not extraordinary, simply the constant indifference that environment distributed to anyone who chose to stand in it. It was under those conditions, alone, isolated, wind cutting at a fixed angle, high-altitude sunlight illuminating everything without warming anything, that Salinas found the formation. It was a circular depression in the soil roughly 20 feet in diameter. Not a hole. There was no structural collapse along the edges, no visible erosion, no sign of external impact. It was an area where the ground had descended uniformly and precisely, as if the earth beneath had compacted vertically without lateral displacement in any direction. The maximum depth at its center was about 9 inches, obvious against the flat terrain surrounding it, yet shallow enough to be overlooked by anyone who did not understand what they were seeing. Salinas understood immediately what he was looking at, and what he was looking at should not have existed. Natural soil compaction processes at elevation, subsidence from freeze-thaw cycles, thermal contraction from extreme temperature shifts, dissolution of soluble minerals through meltwater percolation, produce irregular patterns without exception. Earth does not collapse in radial symmetry. There is no known, documented, or theorized geological mechanism that produces a depression with that degree of radial symmetry absent a buried artificial structure, absent an identifiable external agent of uniform pressure, absent the lateral stress marks any compaction process leaves in surrounding terrain. There were no lateral marks. The perimeter was clean, with an abrupt transition between compacted soil inside and undisturbed ground outside that Salinas measured and remeasured for over an hour, searching for any irregularity that might explain what he was observing. He found none. The symmetry was real. The absence of lateral stress indicators was real, and no combination of geological processes available to 3 decades of field experience could account for it. He remained at the site for 4 hours. He collected soil samples from within the depression at 3 depths, surface 4 inches, 8 inches. He gathered samples immediately outside the perimeter in the 4 cardinal directions. He took control samples 30 feet away. He photographed the formation from multiple angles with the meticulousness of someone who knew he might one day have to defend every inch of that record before people who had not been there. He measured the complete profile of the depression with inch-level precision. He documented everything in his field notebook with the density of someone trying not to lose a single detail before it slipped beyond recall. Then he saw the animals. There were 3 guanacos, the wild ungulates native to those slopes, resilient, highly adapted, survival instincts honed over millennia of coexistence with predators and unforgiving terrain. They were positioned around the depression, each approximately 8 feet from the perimeter, spaced in a configuration that was almost, not perfectly, but almost equidistant from one another, 3 points around a circle separated by nearly regular intervals, as if placed. They were upright, not lying on their sides, not collapsed, kneeling on their folded forelegs, heads lowered in the posture guanacos assume in advanced exhaustion or slow death. But there was no sign of exhaustion, no sign of illness, no sign of anything. They were dead. Salinas approached the nearest and examined it with the disciplined, focused scientific training imposes even when instinct urges retreat. There were no predation marks, no tears, no punctures, no evidence of attack by mountain lion, fox, or any regional predator. There were no signs of disease, no nasal discharge, no lesions, no abdominal distension, none of the visible markers associated with known pathologies affecting the species. The animal was intact, physically normal in appearance, dead in a posture inconsistent with any natural death Salinas had studied or documented in that environment. The same was true of the other 2. Same precision, same physical integrity, same posture, same distance from the depression's edge, as if all 3 had ceased functioning simultaneously at the same instant, in the same place. without time to respond to what was happening within their own bodies. Salinas estimated, based on minimal decomposition consistent with high-altitude cold, that the animals had died no more than 48 hours earlier, which meant they had either been alive when he began his survey that morning or had died in the hours just prior. None displayed the slightest sign of struggle, flight, distress, or behavioral response to threat, reactions those animals were biologically capable of producing. 3 healthy animals, dead simultaneously, positioned symmetrically around a soil formation that should not exist. No identifiable cause by any available metric. Salinas collected muscle tissue samples from each animal, logged the positions with precise coordinates, photographed the full arrangement of bodies relative to the depression, followed every procedural requirement scientific protocol demanded. Then he closed his field notebook, packed his equipment, and left that section of slope without looking back, moving faster than protocol required, faster than reason dictated, driven by something beneath conscious deliberation that had decided it was necessary to leave. Laboratory analysis of the soil samples produced results Salinas recorded internally and never submitted for publication. The mineral composition of the soil inside the depression was radically inconsistent with that of the surrounding hillside, not subtly, not within margins attributable to natural stratigraphic variation, radically inconsistent. Elements present in concentrations not aligned with regional geology, arranged in layers suggesting a formation history entirely different from the adjacent terrain, as if that 20-foot circle did not belong to that slope, as if it had originated elsewhere and been inserted by a process no discipline Salinas commanded could describe. Tissue samples from the guanacos returned inconclusive veterinary findings. No toxins identified. No pathogens detected. No cause of death determined. The report used the clinical phrase simultaneous organ failure of undetermined etiology, which is the technical way of stating that 3 healthy animals stopped functioning at the same time, in the same place, for no measurable reason. Salinas archived everything. He did not publish. He did not present at conferences. He did not discuss it with colleagues. He stored the samples, reports, photographs, and field notebook in a personal file for 10 years, until 2013, when he read the researcher's bulletin, reached the description of the rectangular strip of dead vegetation with near-regular boundaries, of compacted soil with altered coloration, of the spatial silence, described by Marcos Cardenas and Celestina Huanca, in different words but with the same core, and remained still in front of the page for a long moment. Then he picked up the phone and called the researcher. The conversation lasted 3 hours. What Salinas disclosed: the 1983 formation, the impossible mineral composition, the symmetrically positioned dead guanacos, and a third occurrence he had traced in archived records of other field researchers, transformed Rufino Cardenas's disappearance from an isolated incident on a Patagonian hillside into something neither man could dismiss as coincidence. There was a pattern, and the pattern extended back more than 40 years. The third occurrence Salinas had traced was not a human disappearance. It was a photograph taken in 1971 by a field researcher working alone on a slope roughly 110 miles south of Paso Gregores. The image showed a soil formation identical to the one from 1983, and beside that formation, standing upright, looking directly at the camera, was a figure that should not have been there, because that day, on that section of mountain, the researcher had been absolutely alone. And he knew it. And he took the photograph anyway. And he never wrote a single word about what he had captured. The photograph existed. That was the first fact. It was not an oral account passed down over decades, not a reconstructed memory from someone who had been a child at the time, not a second-hand story filtered through layers of interpretation and emotional distance. It was a physical object, a standard black and white print, developed on photographic paper of the era, dated on the back in the photographer's own handwriting with dark blue ballpoint ink that had left a faint indentation in the paper. September 9th, 1971. It had survived more than 40 years inside a cardboard folder stored in a personal archive, and when the researcher Domingo Rise found it among the cataloged belongings of geologist Aurelio Pizarro's estate in 2009, it was intact, slightly yellowed at the edges, the image preserved with enough clarity that every detail could be identified without enlargement or digital enhancement. Aurelio Pizarro had been an independent field researcher, during the 1960s and 1970s, traveling stretches of the Patagonian Andes with intermittent funding from Argentine and Chilean universities interested in cataloging high-altitude geological formations. It was solitary work, physically demanding, poorly paid, and routinely overlooked by formal academia, the kind of work that produced valuable data no one felt urgency to process. Pizarro occupied a peripheral place in that world, competent, meticulous, institutionally marginal. His records were received with mild interest and archived without priority. He died in 2007 at 78, having published only a fraction of what he documented over 3 decades in the field. His estate was managed by his daughter, Graciela Pizarro, who cataloged the materials carefully without fully understanding what she was preserving. It was this collection Domingo Rise accessed in 2009 while researching unpublished 20th century field records from Argentine Patagonia. The September 9, 1971 photograph was inside a folder labeled with approximate coordinates corresponding to a slope roughly 110 miles south of Paso Gregores. The folder contained 12 photographs, 11 depicting soil formations, rock outcrops, and terrain profiles in the objective visual language of technical field documentation, functional framing, no aesthetic composition, no extraneous elements. The kind of photographs an experienced field researcher took automatically, conserving film and prioritizing clarity. The 12th photograph was different in a way that asserted itself before any detailed analysis. The framing was wider, more surrounding terrain was visible. The composition suggested the photographer had stepped back farther than necessary for technical documentation, as if distance was required, as if the central object demanded space around it to be fully seen. At the center of the frame was a circular depression in the soil. Victorino Salinas recognized it instantly and physically when Rise digitized and sent it in 2013. Approximately the same diameter, the same uniform compaction profile, the same complete absence of lateral stress marks along the perimeter, the same abrupt transition between affected and unaffected ground. It was the same formation he had encountered in 1983 50 miles to the north. It was the same formation Ceferino Lamas had photographed in 1987, at the point where Rufino Cardenas's footprints ended, the photographs later removed from the official file. 3 identical formations, 3 separate locations in the same mountain range. 16 years between the first and the last. And in Aurelio Pizarro's 12th photograph, to the left of the depression, there was a figure. It stood approximately 10 feet from the formation's edge, positioned slightly off-center in the frame, with the specific naturalness of something not placed there by the photographer, something simply present when the shutter opened, without invitation, without warning, without the man behind the camera realizing it was being included in the record. The proportions suggested an adult of average height. The clothing appeared dark, a simple cut jacket, trousers, no visible accessories, no field equipment, no backpack, no staff, nothing in the hands or on the body indicating purpose in that isolated terrain at 4,300 feet above sea level. The face was turned directly toward the camera. There was no annotation in Pizarro's folder indicating the presence of another person that day on that slope. No reference in any of the other 11 photographs from that outing to a companion, a meeting, any human presence besides his own. Pizarro's field journals for September 1971, also located by Rise, described that particular excursion using the notation he reserved for solo outings: date, weather conditions, sector surveyed, technical observations. No mention of another person, no mention of the figure, no mention of the photograph containing it. As if it did not exist. As if he had developed the film, seen the image, and made a silent, definitive decision not to write a single word about what he had captured. Salinas remained motionless before the screen for an unmeasured span when he received the digitized file. He leaned closer, zoomed in on the figure, until the grain of black and white dissolved detail into texture without information. The face was oriented toward the camera. That much was unmistakable even at the edge of resolution. The posture was entirely still, without motion blur, meaning the figure had remained absolutely motionless during the exposure. No discernible expression survived the grain. Only the figure, standing, looking, with the unsettling quality of something aware it was being recorded, and entirely unconcerned by it. Rise contacted Graciela Pizarro and asked whether her father had ever mentioned the photograph or the presence of another person. She said he had not. She had never heard him describe an encounter in that sector during that period. But she added something neither Reyes nor Salinas anticipated, something she said with the casual tone of someone recounting a domestic habit without grasping its weight. In the final years of his life, Aurelio Pizarro had developed the habit of waking in the middle of the night and going to the bedroom window to look outside. Every night, with the regularity of compulsion he himself could not explain when asked. When Graciela questioned what he was looking for, he answered the same way each time, with the same words, "Checking to see if we're still alone." She had attributed it to progressive dementia, diagnosed during his final 2 years. After seeing the photograph, she told Rise she was no longer certain. She said it calmly, a calm Rise later described as more disturbing than panic would have been. The calm of someone who has finally placed a piece that never fit, only to discover the completed picture is worse than the confusion. Domingo Reyes published his full analysis in 2014. He connected the 1971 soil formation to the 1983 depression, to the 1987 strip of dead vegetation. He connected the tracking dog's refusal to proceed with the behavior of Celestina Huanca's dogs at the moment of the pressure pulse. He connected the spatial silence described by Marcos Cardenas to the same spatial silence Seferino Lamas reported inside the dead strip. He connected the static light Celestina saw to the pressure displacement she felt in her chest. 3 decades of occurrences along the same range, documented by individuals who did not know one another, who never compared notes, who kept what they knew for different reasons, but with the same core instinct, the certainty that something in that terrain did not want to be named. The scientific establishment ignored the publication. No institution opened an inquiry. No government agency responded. Rufino Cardenas's case remained archived as disappearance, cause undetermined, the same bureaucratic classification it received 18 days after he walked onto the slope, and that no data, no testimony, no photograph had altered in the 27 years since. The formations remain in the mountains. No one has removed them. No one has studied them with the rigor their impossible mineral composition demands. The eastern slope of Paso Gregores exists today exactly as it did in July 1987. The same bone-splitting cold before dawn, the same southwest wind that never truly stops, the same fog rising from the valley with weight and intent, the same rocks, the same paths a man walked for 40 years without ever losing his way. Rufino's staff is still at the point where it was found. The family never removed it. Marcos never fully explained why when asked, only that removing it felt wrong. That the staff marked something that needed to remain marked. That there was something at that exact point on the slope that required acknowledgement, even if no one knew the name of what was being acknowledged. Rufino walked out on an ordinary July morning with his herd, his dogs, his staff, and 40 years of knowledge of that terrain. The ground recorded his steps to a specific point and then stopped. No body, no blood, no cause, no answer. That void is 38 years old. It remains intact, and the fog still climbs from the valley every morning with the silent precision of something that knows exactly what it is covering and has no intention of stopping. If you made it this far, you crossed everything, every footprint, every silence, every detail that should not exist and does. Go ahead and hit like now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The cases featured here are the ones no one closed, no one explained, the ones still unfolding while you watch. Drop a comment below telling me which city you're watching from. I want to know where the people who made it to the end are coming from. Rufino's staff is still there. The land still holds what it did not return, and the next story is already on its way.